In the early 90s, the chemical multi Monsanto began developing genetic technology for plants. It made useful plants, such as canola and soya, resistant to the company's own pesticide, Roundup. Roundup kills every plant, without exception. Only the organically modified canola survives. In this way, Monsanto sells the farmers not only the patented seeds, but also the chemicals to match. Roundup spray is the most frequently sold pesticide in the world. However, there are also farmers who have had dealings with Monsanto against their own will. Probably the most famous one is Percy Schmeiser from Canada.
There was one other reason, too, that we stood up to Monsanto, was the fact that they had destroyed what my wife and I had developed over 50 years of research and development. Canola seeds that were resistant to various diseases we had on the prairies. They destroyed what we developed. And I'm sure that if I would do that Monsanto, I would be thrown in jail. But they can come on to a farmer or contaminate a farmer's field and destroy what he has worked on and get a lawsuit on top of it.
Percy Schmeiser operates a 650-hectare farm which his grandparents, immigrants from Bavaria and Austria, cultivated 100 years ago. In 1996, Monsanto introduced its genetically modified canola to Canada. A heavy storm during harvest time blew it onto Percy Schmeiser's fields. In August 1998, he was sued for illegally cultivating patented seeds from Monsanto. 2 courts sentenced him to pay damages to Monsanto of roughly $100,000, but refusing to be intimidated by the chemical giant, he took the case as far as the Canadian Supreme Court. The court made a distinction. On the one hand, as the court made expressly clear, Schmeiser had infringed Monsanto's patent because he had actively cultivated Roundup Ready canola and was thus no longer an impartial onlooker. On the other hand, the court decided that Schmeiser did not have to pay damages to Monsanto because he had not enriched himself by means of the genetic canola in his grain. Percy Schmeiser is now contemplating a countersuit against the global group on the grounds of environmental contamination, destruction of seeds, and defamation of character. International environmental organizations are competing to gain Percy Schmeiser as a speaker, to warn farmers in the US, Europe, and also the so-called Third World about chemical multis. In the last 2 years alone, he has visited over 40 countries.
In 1996, when GMO canola was introduced, we didn't have anybody to come and tell us what could happen or may happen. But now people from around the world do know from our experiences what has happened: contamination, loss of biodiversity, loss of our pure seed, and choice taken away. So we now know what can happen because of our experience with soybeans and with GMO canola. And we know what would happen also with GMO wheat. And that's why other people around the world can benefit from our experience. We don't have no choice left. Our choice is gone. But the people in many parts of the world still have a choice.
Welcome back to Green Time. I'm the host for this episode, Barbara Chicherio, and my guests are on my left, Digger and Don Fitz.
Welcome back.
I had a burning question that I wanted to ask before the last break, but when I watched Unnatural Selection, I was very concerned because it seems like there's some pretty big decisions about how food is going to be grown and the kinds of foods we're going to be eating. And so who's making these decisions?
Well, it's big corporations, but it's important to think about what the decisions are being made. We actually have less variety of food to choose from now than our ancestors did 100 years ago. And there's been a dramatic decrease in biodiversity, which means the variety of species that we eat. And what this means is, and genetic modification really speeds this process up because it lets farmers have a uniform process, which is very, very dangerous. They're making the decisions to use just a few foods that are very profitable, which means that if there's some climate change are pests that wipe these out, then the world food supply is threatened much, much more than if we have hundreds of species of corn. If we only have 5 or 6 species of corn, we're in real danger.
Monocultures, yeah.
That's right. Yeah, it's corporations that are making decisions, and they're supposed to be regulated by agencies like the EPA and the FDA. The problem is that these agencies that are supposed to be watching out for us are actually sort of in the pocket of Monsanto. There's what we call a revolving door between Monsanto and the FDA and EPA. And in other words, people work for Monsanto, or in the case of like Michael Taylor, he was a lawyer for Monsanto, and he ended up working for the FDA and making the decision about how GMOs would be regulated. And it's through him and James Mariansky, who was also with the FDA, who also became a Monsanto employee, an executive, that they just came up with this thing of substantial equivalence. And what they're saying is that, GMOs, like genetically modified corn or soy, are substantially equivalent to standard corn and soy. So they don't need to be tested. And so there has been virtually no testing on these crops. Yet even though they're substantially equivalent, they can still get a patent.
And that's the ultimate contradiction.
Yeah,
In other words, it's like one team of lawyers will go out and say, we have to have a patent because it's substantially different than what exists, and they'll say that to one federal agency. And another team of Monsanto lawyers will go to a different agency and say it's not substantially different, it's substantially equivalent, so that we can, so that we don't have, you don't have to have tests on it because it's substantially equivalent to other products.
Well, speaking of lawyers, because we saw a little bit about what Percy Schmeiser was going through in Saskatchewan, so Digger, maybe you could talk a little bit about what's happening. It's not just Percy, but other farmers who, I mean, there are a couple different legal issues. One is seed saving, and the other one is if Monsanto, in fact, finds their patented DNA in a plant on another farmer's land.
That's right.
So what's the story
So
behind
when a farmer chooses to use GMOs on his farm, he signs a technology agreement, and it's a very ironclad agreement that says he can't save seeds and he has to pay all this money, and he has to allow Monsanto on his land to inspect his crops and take samples at every time. Well, so this, you can see where problems would be there. But Percy Schmeiser in Saskatchewan, Canada, he never planted the genetically modified canola. Pollen had drifted into his field and contaminated his plants. Well, Monsanto employees apparently illegally entered his farm, took samples from his canola, and they found their patented DNA in his plant. Now, you would think that really Monsanto should pay damages to Percy because they had contaminated his plants, but the opposite happened. They told him, well, now you have our patented DNA, and you have to sign a technology agreement, and you have to pay us all this money. And they've done this to many farmers, and a lot of times farmers, they're intimidated by Monsanto. They don't want to get into a court case. So they'll go ahead and pay. But Percy, a very ethical person who I've had a chance to talk with a lot, refused to do this. And he pursued this case all the way to the Canadian Supreme Court, where he was finally vindicated. But yet the court held that life forms could be patented.
What I find amazing about this whole series of events is that none of the Monsanto agents have been arrested for trespass.
I know it.
And there's all sorts of things in criminal court. You see this all the time about how if the evidence is not gained correctly, the case will be thrown out. Well, why in the world do the courts allow Monsanto to present evidence when they could not have obtained the evidence except through a criminal process of trespassing in someone's land? Why are other cases thrown out when there's criminal activity by the prosecutors, but when there's criminal activity by Monsanto, the case is not thrown out?
Our time is growing short, but I would really like to address, we've got about 30 seconds left, Roundup.
Well,
some plants are genetically engineered so that they're not adversely affected by Roundup, like soybeans. And so,
these are Roundup ready crops, and they're
Right.
engineered to, when you spray the Roundup, they won't kill the crop, so it'll kill the other weeds. The problem is that the weeds are already
Right.
getting resistance to Roundup, so the Roundup's not working, just as we had said 10 years
and
ago.
I'm going to have to cut you off, but our next show, I'm going to bring this up again because we're going to be revisiting this. So I'm sorry to cut you off because this is very important. Thank you for viewing Green Time, and view the next show because we're going to have more discussion about this, and we're going to finish up our discussion about Roundup. Thank you.